I really appreciate the way Harold draws together the different intersections between these issues and shared fates that are critical to addressing not just HIV and AIDS in the United States and worldwide, but how critical it is to looking at issues of racism and homophobia, transphobia, economic injustice. There are so many interconnections between different areas of work that all come together as we're looking at the global AIDS response. So we're ready now for our first panel. It's my honor to introduce Greg Millett, and I'll ask Greg and the panelists of the first panel to come on up. Greg is going to be moderating our first panel, HIV and AIDS Policy in 2023, What's at Stake? Greg is Vice President and Director of Public Policy at AMFAR. He's a well-published and nationally recognized epidemiologist and researcher with significant experience working at the highest level of federal HIV policy development at both the White House and the Centers for Disease Control. Previously, he served as a detailee at the White House Office of National AIDS Policy as a senior policy advisor, where he coordinated the office's HIV prevention policy and the interagency process to develop the national AIDS strategy. He's actually one of the 3 writers of President Obama's national AIDS strategy. While at the White House, he worked on a range of policy issues, including the elimination of the HIV entry ban that prohibited HIV persons with traveling to or asking for residency in the United States, and the reallocation of HIV prevention resources by CDC to adopt a new formula for state and local health departments, better aligning the funding with the current disease burden. All of our speakers have bios online at the FCAA website, and they all have about 3 times the content and experience and credentials than I'm even reading today. So please check them out. Greg's work has been exceptional. Thank you for coming on up and moderating this first panel.
Can the panelists please come to the front? Thank you. It is wonderful being here this morning. I'm really happy to see so many friends and colleagues that we haven't seen in the last couple of years because of the pandemic, and to talk about a lot of the specific policy issues that are facing us. I think that Mason, Jesse, and Harold really did a commanding job of, interrogating what our charge is today and a lot of the threats that we're facing. And I think that Harold in particular really named a specific issue that is going to be problematic for us, and that is funding. We know that budgets don't necessarily stay stable, that across administrations that there are different priorities, there are different things that leaders think about, both domestically as well as globally. And as we think about ending HIV by 2030, it's not a one-time thing. We don't just end it at 2030 and then we all shake hands and go home. We have to keep it ended, which requires continued funding. So I think that the panel here is going to be able to interrogate many of these issues that were brought up earlier this morning, and to really get us started on an honest discussion of where we are in terms of policy in HIV. So first I'd like to introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to invite them to speak. Lindsay Dawson is the Associate Director of HIV Policy and Director of LGBTQ Policy at Kaiser Family Foundation. Ambassador Mark Lugon is the Chief Policy Officer of Friends of the Global Fight. Everyone, thankfully, knows of Harold, who we had a wonderful, rousing speech just earlier from the White House Office of National AIDS Policy. Mukame Marete is the Executive Director of UHI, the East African Sexual Health and Rights Initiative. And Nikki Tyler is the Partnerships Director of the Office of Global AIDS Coordinator and Health Diplomacy at PEPFAR. Please join me in welcoming our panel this morning. And with that, I'd like to start with the opening remarks for each of the panelists. Lindsay?
Good morning. It's so nice to be here with everybody and with this wonderful panel, so thank you. I'm going to touch on sort of the major areas I'm thinking about with respect to domestic HIV policy, where we're at, what might get in our way, and where we're going. So HIV funding, which we've already been hearing quite a bit about, the Medicaid continuous eligibility unwinding, the Braidwood PrEP decision, and then briefly just on the social political environment that we're living in and how that might impact our ability to address HIV domestically. So Harold made really wonderful remarks on the need for HIV funding and what we might do with increased funding. And I'm going to offer you a little bit of a history lesson. So when we look at U.S. domestic HIV federal funding, we see pretty sharp increases from 1981 into the early 90s, and then smaller increases, a leveling off, and with EHE, small but modest increases again. But when we hold domestic discretionary funding constant for inflation in about 1990, we really see a decline. And at the same time, we see greater HIV prevalence. We see greater HIV prevalence for two reasons. One speaks to successes, right? People have access to ARVs, they're living longer, healthier lives, but we are seeing about 30,000 new infections in the US each year. And so there's 1.2 million people living with HIV. And what this means is when you put the two together, that we're doing more with less. And so that's the context for funding and speaks in part to the need for funding. And globally, we see something a little bit similar, increases to about 2010, a real leveling off, and then some modest increases more recently. With respect to the Medicaid continuous eligibility, I'm guessing many of you are familiar with this, but if not, the very brief history is that with the public health emergency, one of the provisions that Congress made was that those who are enrolled in Medicaid can stay enrolled throughout the duration of the public health emergency. It's since been uncoupled from that emergency, and states have started the unwinding process, meaning that if you're Medicaid eligible and don't get redetermined, you can lose coverage. Nationally, about 20 million people gained Medicaid coverage between March 2020 and present. We think from anecdotal conversations I've had that for people with HIV, those increases weren't quite at that same level, and we can talk about that more if you're interested or have questions. I have some ideas around that. But I think what the thread is here is that folks aren't as familiar with doing the redetermination, right? So it really puts in place this moment where people with HIV might lose Medicaid coverage and lose continuous sort of engagement with the care system. And so that's a threat to individuals, it's a threat to public health, but it also poses a challenge for the Ryan White program. As more people lose Medicaid, the Ryan White program may be responsible for care and treatment for a number of folks that they hadn't been in the past. Third is the Braidwood and PrEP decision, and that's certainly going to tie into my remarks about the socio-political environment. In this, Judge Reed O'Connor in Texas, who is no friend of the ACA, decided that preventive services that got put in place and had an A or B grade from the USPSTF after March 2010 no longer are going to be required to be covered without cost sharing for people with private health insurance. I think it's important to say that I think some of the reporting around this has been a little bit overblown. I believe that people will still have access to PrEP through private insurance plans. Plans will likely still cover the medication. But what we'll see is cost sharing for the medication, for the provider visits, and for some of the labs. And while costs might be nominal if you're on generic PrEP, we know that even nominal cost sharing can be a burden to access. So certainly something to watch for and think about whether there's a role for philanthropy, for those in care, providing care to people with HIV can play a role in helping to maintain access. And then finally, the general socio-political environment. We've already heard a lot about this today, and our next panel is going to go into this in some detail. So just top line, really the efforts to undermine access to care for LGBTQ plus people, Tennessee's decision to reject CDC HIV funding, and the PrEP decision that really pits religious freedoms against health and healthcare access are really pivotal and undermine our ability to address HIV. Thank you.
now? Great. So I'm with Friends of the Global Fight Against AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, and we are leading advocates for the Global Fund, looking at the international scene. But we're deeply invested in PEPFAR as well. And I think it's important to, as a message of mine today will be that we can walk and chew gum at the same time, that we need to think about older, long-standing assets and newer ones for the fight against AIDS. PEPFAR and the Global Fund reinforce each other. And there's a strong argument for backing for both. They coordinate with each other in the COPs and in the country coordinating mechanisms that the Global Fund insists on, with an emphasis on civil society and multi-stakeholder work. Both have in their DNA a key populations and human rights focus. And of course, that's enormously important today. The latest statistics available indicate that 70% of infections globally are among key populations, and 51% of them in Africa are. So that focus is essential. Both PEPFAR and the Global Fund have been strengthening health systems and strengthening the ability of countries to offer, with equity, access to healthcare and create a situation of resilience for inevitable pandemics, as we've seen how COVID-19 threw off AIDS response. But countries and those two programs fought back. What does the Global Fund add? It adds burden sharing. I guess that's language that the right side of the political spectrum might use. But the Global Fund messaging about the Global Fund on burden sharing is important to show that burden sharing is happening. Other donors, for instance, other country donors, but also businesses. My colleague, Jen Lolito, who leads RED, they've been involved in mobilizing $700 million for the Global Fund from the private sector. They're a long-standing asset that needs to be reinforced. She's here in the red top if you want to talk to her at some point. But the Global Fund is in 120 countries, more countries than PEPFAR is actively in today. And they're assisted in thinking about the future. We do not want a day when the aid ends and governments are left to their own devices not to emphasize key populations. But they think actively at the Global Fund about what happens with transition. I want to take a little further this context described domestically and look at the international. Geopolitically, there's a deep focus on China. And I just want to say it may seem like instrumentalizing it, but it will motivate people in the U.S. political system to fund HIV programs in PEPFAR and the Global Fund. Perhaps in your eyes for the wrong reason, or perhaps it's important to grapple with China as a governance model, an influence that is bad for civil society in general. Internationally, donors are weary, and there's deep competition for money. You know about this. Climate change is important to infectious diseases. It drives it up. But there is competition for resources, particularly public sector resources, and of course, food insecurity driven up by Ukraine and refugees are competing with HIV/AIDS. And there's an important work. The administration has played a leading role in this to create a pandemic fund, but inevitably there's going to be some competition for funding. In low and middle income countries, helping equip civil society to fight for domestic resource mobilization and to fight for programs to be focused on the right people, key populations and the marginalized is essential. Generally, there's an authoritarian wave in the world. I used to be President of Freedom House. It's documented 17 or 18 years in a row of a backsliding of democratic norms in the world that squeezes civil society, and specifically, we see an acute pushback on key populations, especially this phenomenon in East Africa that we need to watch, starting with Uganda, but not ending with Uganda. So there's really an opportunity to fund advocacy, both in donor countries. Friends works with counterparts, Friends Japan and Friends Europe, on advocacy in donor countries, but we need to continue to think about how to equip civil society partners, some of whom are in the room, to fight for domestic resource mobilization and key populations. I want to end with the domestic situation and take some things you know well and perhaps sharpen how you think about them. The word I would use for Republicans, Republicans are populist and anti-foreign aid and anti-multilateral, but even more acutely than they have been. But perhaps more dangerous are those who are not aware of the details of PEPFAR, and especially the Global Fund, and can caricature them. My greatest fear is that the argument made by the new populist Republicans that there were forever wars in Iraq and Afghanistan will get applied to PEPFAR, another of Bush's forever wars. I think we can avert that, but we need to continue with our, excuse the expression, strange bedfellow coalitions, something I've had the pleasure of working on China, human rights, human trafficking, and wonderfully HIV/AIDS. The faith-based community is a double-edged sword, but they are still essential. We work with 2030 Collaborative, which reaches out to faith leaders around the country, and they're culturally right of center, but horrified by some things. Our colleagues who we work with on international advocacy for the Congress to fund the Global Fund organized a letter of faith leaders around the country and Tennessee to pressure the governor and the health commissioner to turn around their initiative to deny acceptance of federal funding. We're oddly thematically liberated. It's a hard political environment, but the argument and the evidence, for instance, that the Bipartisan Policy Center has come out with that shows the U.S. has gained strategic diplomatic advantages through PEPFAR, that's all the more viable an argument to make with regard to the U.S. standing in the world, bruised, with regard to China. Republican turnover and that part of the unmoored quality of not being familiar with PEPFAR and the Global Fund means that actually, after COVID, we can argue for funding health systems internationally. And you don't have this sort of pattern of 20 years of saying, should not have mission creep of PEPFAR and the Global Fund. And I think we need to take that example in East Africa of key populations and the onslaught on the LGBT community and point to it, and dare others in the political system to say that's not important. So I'll close with this, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Ideals and interests are key to advocacy. We can talk about the importance to continue the fight to the end of an epidemic on HIV/AIDS, but we also can talk about interests of the United States in getting burden sharing from other countries or businesses through the Global Fund, the interest of the public image of the United States vis-a-vis China and Africa. We can focus on women and focus on key populations in advocacy. I talked earlier about the statistics on key populations, but it remains a vital argument for advocacy to show that the problem and the progress are there on adolescent girls and young women. 6 out of 7 adolescent infections is female in Africa, but there is huge progress to sustain as AIDS-related mortality for women and girls has gone down 57% since 2010. And finally, and I know this is unpopular among some quarters, we can argue for both the vertical and the horizontal health. There is evidence that PEPFAR, the Global Fund, other so-called vertical programs have contributed markedly to strengthening health systems, UHC, and pandemic preparedness. And there's a cruel irony that focus on pandemic preparedness could lead to the very siloing and fragmentation that the AIDS movement has been accused of. It's crazy to go backwards from programs that incorporated civil society into their governance and implementation and not have that voice in pandemic preparedness. We need to do it all together and recognize that to fight for the future of funding for PEPFAR, Global Fund, and other programs, we need to say they're essential for finishing the job on HIV/AIDS, but also important for equity of access generally and being prepared for the inevitable pandemics. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Harold, I want to give you the opportunity to perhaps start the panel discussion by weighing in after the rest of the panelists give their first impressions. Thank you. Wonderful. Mukami?
Is it on? Yes. I come from UHAI, the East Africa Sexual Health and Rights Initiative. We are of the LGBTQ and sex worker movements in 7 countries in Eastern Africa. That is Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania, Ethiopia, and the DRC. And we work, our main work is in activist grant making in these countries, resourcing LGBTQ and sex worker movements. And through this, we've been able to support our communities to win critical court cases. We did not think that we'll be back with an anti-homosexuality bill, which is likely to be act if the president ascends it today. But we led the efforts in the last time. So challenging and overturning oppressive laws, resourcing, pioneering community-led clinics, initiatives, supporting documentation, supporting advocacy, and just organizing for sexual and gender minorities and sex workers. To date, we started working in 2009, and we've been able to support about 15 million USD to about 200 organizations. That's quite a lot. And through this, there have been, and I'll be talking about some of the gains that have been made, but also with the current moment that we are in, what it is that we are losing, what it is that is at stake, especially around, the dream world, which is having a world without HIV. And there's a lot of hope, and I know Mason hopefully say that it is possible, but I am having a hard time holding on to that. There have been milestones in the growth of the movements to be able to challenge governments. There has been advancement within public health policies in our countries, with several governments in the region having, explicitly addressing the needs of LGBTQI and sex worker communities. Having them included as key populations within the national policies. We've seen quite a lot of resilience and winning within the court spaces. In Kenya, the most recent one being the win by the National Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission, who were able to, who won a case at the Supreme Court around their registration through the NGO board. Ironically, that also has sparked quite a bit of moral panic and hatred towards our communities, but yes. Yeah, so what are the threats and how then does this affect even the working of Global Fund and PEPFAR and just the philanthropic space in the region? We've talked. We've had the Uganda anti-homosexuality bill mentioned quite a bit today. It is one of the. It is actually, I think, the most extreme bill against homosexuality in the world, providing for life imprisonment and death penalty for homosexuality, proposing imprisonment of children convicted for homosexuality, describes charges for those who rent or fund LGBTQ communities in the countries, meaning that people cannot be cannot be able to rent housing, cannot be able to access funding, and those who actually are allies also get criminalized. It imposes a duty on Ugandans to report persons in same-sex relationships to authorities, and it restricts access to HIV and SRHR services by criminalizing persons and entities providing services to LGBTQ plus people. Earlier, sometime this month, there was a convening held in Uganda. The president of Uganda, along politicians from several countries in the continent, held a family protection meeting. Ironic, and we've really witnessed a duplication of what it is that is happening in Uganda in quite a number of other countries in the continent, but more specifically in Kenya. Now we have a bill that is going to be that's already been introduced but not gazetted within the parliament. It hasn't been discussed by the parliament yet, but it is very similar to the Uganda bill, with even further and very specific language around access to gender affirming services. Very, it's quite explicit in speaking to that. And also we've seen on last week on Monday, and there was a bill that was sneakily passed in the Kenyan parliament. Actually, it was spoken about in Swahili, just to make sure that words like LGBTQ are not caught and monitored, but it really it's a censorship law around what it is that the media can report, and this really then would limit even just the reporting of the violations that are happening against the communities. What is all this doing to our people? It means that funding, fueling justice, it's a whole huge step back towards the progress around a world without HIV. Ironically, the anti-LGBTQ frenzy in Uganda coincided with the Zero Discrimination Day on 1st of March, when the UNAIDS highlighted the need to remove laws that criminalize people living with HIV and key populations. People are not being able to access services. People are scared. Guys have gone, they're hiding, cannot be able to get the life affirming services that they have been able to. So basically, the enabling environment that is needed to accompany the progress that has been made in the scientific progress around HIV does not exist. I know I've talked about Kenya and I've talked about Uganda, but the same is being replicated in the region. We have in Tanzania, in the last month, 3 people already are jailed with 30-year prison sentences for admitting to homosexuality. So what this practically means is that the gains that were made around community-led monitoring, around activists being part of processes, PEPFAR and Global Fund processes, that also are aimed at holding governments accountable around their responsibility for providing services to our communities, they can't participate anymore, because then you're actually admitting to a crime that can cost your life or can cause very long prison sentences. So it totally delegitimizes those processes. It also means that, we have quite a bit of data with our governments that, has been provided through partnerships. As I said, there has been gains in policies that include communities, and this has been because of sharing of data around our communities. Now, that data is being used by some government officials, technocrats, or just people as information to attack us. Like where do people live? Where do they organize? Where do they access services? That is what we've seen it happening in Tanzania specifically, and Uganda, in knowing who's doing what in the country. So that further really then means that a lot of the work that was already happening cannot continue to happen. Finally, so what is it that then can be done? Because there's a lot of, I don't want to leave us with a message of hopelessness, because the communities are organized and they are fighting and pushing back with support from all of us in this room. They are folk with influence in the way of being able to influence our governments, through diplomatic ways that our movements are working, directly to just share the house around, if I look at our partnerships with the US, we have trade agreements, we have all these people who are spreading hate, having visas and children studying in your country. Why should they be able to access services that we cannot access, and why should they be able to continue accessing that privilege? So those are just very direct ways in which folk can be held accountable, but also just continuing to resource movements around just even within the crisis, there's still importance of continuing the work around pushing back and having the enabling environment, pushing back against the systems that have provided this, this space. And Harold did share that, the problem is transphobia. The problem is homophobia. So how do we we do need to support movements to be able to keep pushing back against what is going on in the region. We are bracing ourselves for a long legal journey. We are bracing ourselves for a process of just supporting communities to be safe, safety and security, supporting work around communication, supporting work around narrative change. We've seen in Uganda a group of parents coming out and saying that these are our children. These children are, the propaganda around LGBTIQ being a Western issue, yet ironically the pushback is coming and is funded very heavily by evangelicals and anti-right groups in the West, amplifying this. Folk need to actually see what this looks like. And I think as a philanthropic, within philanthropy, we are at that moment where we were thinking about how do we are at war. Actually, let me use that word. We are in a place where communities are at war. How do we then support movements that are in that space? How are our governments also, held to the standards of, even if you are in war, they are just basic things that around public health, like it doesn't matter who you are, you need to be able to access services, and our governments need to know this. Like, let's put us, whatever, we're in a situation of war, but even at times of war, they're just basic things that have to happen. Can they be held account? Can this be amplified in terms of how it is that, the diplomatic pressure looks like? And I'll stop there for now. Yeah.
Thank you for the very thoughtful remarks, Mukami. Nikki?
If I could cede my time to Mukami to hear more, I really would. So appreciate you grounding us in the country perspective, and so important to what we do. And I think a lot of what Mukami spoke about speaks to the complexity of programming from PEPFAR. So I'm the director of partnerships at PEPFAR, and never a dull moment at PEPFAR, as you can imagine, and certainly not right now. Ambassador Nkengasong sends his thanks for this. He cannot make it, as he, of course, is at the hearing on the Hill right now, but just extends his gratitude for everything that this forum does and the folks in this room. One other link, as Mukami was speaking, that really made me reflect on what we're doing at PEPFAR now. It also ties to what Jesse said in his opening remarks, which was nothing for us without us. And I think that saying is something that the ambassador and the senior leadership of PEPFAR has really taken to heart, to think through how we can center voices in our programming and how we can design it from the country level to really address the key equity gaps and the key challenges that are coming up at each country. We had our annual COP planning, so our annual budgeting cycle and programming cycle about in January. And for those of you who have followed that, it was a brand new way that we did COP, which was extremely exciting. Very much putting ministries of health in the lead to design the programming that they thought were priorities. And of course, having civil society very well represented in all the rooms and thinking through how we at PEPFAR can facilitate and encourage those dialogues between government and civil society, given the critical partnership needs between both those important stakeholders. So something we're very focused on now as well. I was asked to speak briefly to an update on PEPFAR as it relates to reauthorization, what we're doing, as well as some of what we're excited about right now. So I'll briefly speak to that. But as folks know, under Ambassador Nkengasong's leadership, PEPFAR recently released our 5-year strategy, which has 5 pillars that we're pushing on, really strategic North Stars that we're all very excited about, as well as 3 cross-cutting enablers. Teams are executing on those. I'll speak a bit to some of those specific priorities when I get to some of the partnership opportunities that we're discussing. But that 5-year strategy is really grounding us as we think about what we want to focus on. And of course, it was built from country engagement as well. So hearing how country government, civil society, key POPs can really play a role in determining where they think PEPFAR can be most supportive as we look to end the AIDS pandemic by 2030. A few things that we're really focused on as well. When I started at PEPFAR, it's funny, I told my mom I was working at PEPFAR, and she said, I have never heard of that. What is it? And that gets back to your comments, Mark, around strange bedfellows and how we think about highlighting what is one of the best kept secrets that we have in public health, certainly in US history and potentially in world history. And Mason or Jesse mentioned this, but of course PEPFAR has facilitated 20 million folks on treatment overseas, 25 million lives have been saved. And then Kaiser Foundation recently also released statistics around in a world without PEPFAR, in the countries where PEPFAR operates, that per capita GDP would have been 2% lower than without PEPFAR. So not only is PEPFAR a public health intervention, but it has also changed the development trajectory of a lot of countries in Africa. And Mason spoke well, too, to some of the intersectionalities we see around public health and everything else that comes with it, like economic growth and beyond. So we're really focused, of course, on continuing to tell that story of PEPFAR in ways that resonates with people, but that this is one of the best kept secrets and one of the most successful public health programs in US or international world history. But with that, we still have a lot of work to do. And everyone on this panel, everyone who spoke on keynotes has mentioned that. So many countries are closing in on the 95, 95, 95 gaps. Some are a little farther away. And even for those countries that are at the 95, 95, 95 targets, we still know that there are equity gaps there. So there is work to be done. UNAIDS also showed that progress has slowed recently. And I think we all know that I'm preaching to the choir here, but how we tie together that PEPFAR has been enormously successful with the fact that we have not completed our mission. We have not completed our SDG goal by 2030. Collectively, that's us together, is something that we're really focused on as well. Two other things I'll speak to briefly is how we at PEPFAR continue the movement towards sustainable and shared responsibility. So other folks have spoken to this too. But as we think through a world of transitioning and continuing to transition some of our programming to country governments, how can we look for efficiencies within our programming and how we can build, continue to build systems so that governments can take these on. And there's a lot of discussion right now at PEPFAR about creating sustainability roadmaps, of course, that will be led by the Ministries of Health and Ministries of Finance, but that is something that is ongoing and will continue to roll out in the next year. And we're really excited, again, to responsibly have those conversations with governments and see how we can support that transition as we come closer and closer to 2030. And again, many folks have spoken to this as well. I was actually on the COVID task force for three years, so have a lot of thoughts on COVID and how PEPFAR really stepped up and had a role there in global architecture to respond to public health threats. And we see more and more of those. We had monkeypox, which the US government had an enormously successful response to. Through COVID, PEPFAR was also a really backbone of our response as well. So thinking through how we can use these health systems that PEPFAR has contributed to building in partnership with governments and many others to really strengthen and think beyond HIV/AIDS while really holding true to our mandate at PEPFAR that we are funded for HIV/AIDS. So we don't shy away from that, but we certainly understand that we need to approach this with a health systems approach. And Ambassador Nkengasong, too, is thinking through and implementing a lot of exciting initiatives around NCDs and mental health, given the direct linkages between those and people living with HIV and comorbidities. I think I'll end with just a plea on the partnership side, because I am a partnerships person. I am looking actively to find new partners to bring to this space. I believe it was Jesse who mentioned that about two of the philanthropies in the room represent about 67% or so of total funding around HIV/AIDS. We at PEPFAR, even though folks know of us as about a $6 billion program, we need to partner with others. And one partnership in particular that I'm pursuing, or that the types of partnerships that I'm really excited, how can we use philanthropy or private capital to identify new and innovative ways or new and innovative methods, products, be it CAB-LA, be it behavior change, that we can then integrate into our infrastructure overseas. We really look to philanthropic partners, private sector partners and the like to help us with that innovation so then it can be put in and integrated into our programming. So just a few quick examples of that. Regional manufacturing is something we're very focused on right now. So we are working very closely with the Global Fund on that, of course, and ERP and WHO, the African Development Banks and others to try to identify manufacturers in Africa to meet the ambitious goals that we've set out by 2025 and 2030. And another one that I'm actively pursuing and folks are interested is how can we set up blended financing facilities and tap into private capital and DFI types of capital to build financing facilities that can support private sector enterprises or private sector innovations that then have a broader, of course, health system strengthening. And I'll stop. One good example of that too that was done recently is with about $1 million of capital from USAID, Catalytic Grant Capital, we drew in about $100 million of DFI and private investment to scale those up and develop a better capital stack. I'm a finance person at heart, people might hear. But those are the types of partnerships that we're looking to pursue. And again, just really grateful for the partnership that we've had with you all as we continue to push ahead and meet our collective goals by 2030.
Thank you so much, Nikki. There were several things that I heard during the overview of the panel. Among them were, many of the policy challenges that we're seeing in the United States. Some of them proximal, like the end of the public health emergency and Medicaid expansion and what that might mean for people living with HIV. Other proximal, of course, is the SCOTUS decision on reproductive health and what that might mean for populations of women who are at high risk for HIV. And then some of them are long-term, such as the Braidwood decision and what this might mean in terms of accessibility of preventative services from 2024 and beyond. Other things that I heard as well is, the fact that leveraging partnerships, cost sharing, and mobilizing domestic funding in countries is incredibly important, particularly when we're thinking about moving towards sustainability, as well as the critical importance of continuing to fund civil society. The other thing I heard as well is how important it is for us to support key populations, in particular considering the degree to which they represent not only the domestic, but the global HIV epidemic. And some of the policy challenges that are taking place both domestically and globally for some of these populations. One thing I do want to mention is that there was a Lancet paper that came out in January where they were looking at criminalization of MSM in sub-Saharan African countries, where they found that those countries that have any criminalization policies, that MSM HIV infection was 7 times greater than the general population. If they had recent criminalization policies, it was 15 times greater in HIV infection. So these policies definitely have an impact on whether or not we're going to be able to end the epidemic. And it's not just sub-Saharan Africa. We see the same types of criminalization for MSM, for PWID, for others in Russia, Hungary, and other places in the world. And then the last thing I heard as well was, PEPFAR, that in some ways, we are a victim of our own success, that, we have done this incredible job, but for some reason, we have not done well in terms of proselytizing how remarkable this achievement is. We also haven't done well in proselytizing how remarkable our achievements have been in the domestic response. And what does this mean in terms of being able to procure additional funding, to leverage additional partnerships, to end HIV both domestically and globally? Harold, I just wanted to turn some of this to you to see if there's any other additional things that you heard from the beginning to help kick us off for the panel.
Yeah, thank you, Greg, and thank you to the panel as well. I think they pretty much covered the entirety of the landscape right now, with sort of what's before us and also some of the challenges that we have, as well as the opportunities. As you were talking about PEPFAR being one of the best kept secrets, in 2021, as President Biden launched his national HIV/AIDS strategy, I had an opportunity to be in the Oval Office with him and had worked with the speech writing team on his World AIDS Day speech. And so I was nervous as hell. But at the same time, he looked at the speech and he sort of said, I like how you've included PEPFAR. And I was like, yeah, it is World AIDS Day. So yes. And I'm thinking in my head, because there was a conversation that I was having in my head through this out-of-body experience. And he said, is that right? 25 million people. And I'm like, yes, Mr. President, that is correct. And he said, that's an incredible thing. And he even said, W doesn't get enough credit for that. So I'm going to sort of expand on this part of the speech. And it was one of those moments where it was like, because I'm also a PEPFAR alum. So I worked in PEPFAR previously as well. And so it was one of those things where I had realized before working in PEPFAR, the incredible opportunity that it presents and how it is the best of us in the work that we do within those countries. And so I was really grateful that he got to see that and we sort of got to share that moment together. I think when the panel touched on this also, that, with our PEPFAR and Global Fund investments, which are HIV focused, there is the opportunity, and we've seen this, where there has been, the spillover effects. So I'm going to take us back a little bit to another infectious disease, Ebola. And when I was working in PEPFAR, we saw nations that were able to control the Ebola epidemic as a result of the PEPFAR investments in both health systems, healthcare workers, community health workers, messaging and working with civil society. And so we were hearing these examples of like In Nigeria, emergency room workers who were able to do and implement infection control procedures because they knew what they were looking at, they knew what they were doing. Community health workers that were in Uganda and in Democratic Republic of Congo who were doing this work and educating the public. And there were PEPFAR and Global Fund grantees and recipients, and it was those investments that were making a difference. The other thing I think folks sometimes don't sort of realize is that the speed in developing a COVID-19 vaccine was on the back of HIV research. So we're out of our houses today because of the HIV researchers and the investment that had gone into HIV research previously. And I'm extremely grateful for that. We have also shown that, as some of the panelists mentioned, that some of what was learned in HIV we applied to COVID, and we were able to have systems that were flexible to be able to respond appropriately, again, due to that HIV investment. And before we go too far, and there was an article in the New York Times that talked about how gay men saved us all from Mpox. Well, it wasn't just them. It was also that HIV investment that also went into the health system, where we still hadn't turned the system off completely from COVID, but were able to rapidly respond. Right now in the White House, there is a team that is focused on pandemic preparedness. And what I have said to them is, let's not be an afterthought when it comes to the HIV community, because you called us a little late to the party when it came to COVID. And we jumped in there and we did the work. The next pandemic preparedness plan must include investments in the HIV system as well. The other thing that I'm pointing out, sort of ending with COVID, is recent reports have shown that in the United States, the rate of white deaths has eclipsed Black and Latinx because of the work that we've been doing around ensuring that trusted messengers delivered the messages about the vaccine, about making vaccine available in those communities. And so I think for the first time, we're really seeing equity works. So not only sort of the investment in the HIV infrastructure and system, but also centering equity and centering community makes a difference, which is why we have these rates in some of our red states in the United States that are what they are right now. And we can all be here maskless. But I think the panel has sort of summarized a lot of that as well.
I think that's a really nice way to jumpstart us into the panel discussion. I mean, you mentioned two things in particular that I think is really important and bears repeating is the fact that, HIV has been able to lift all boats for many other diseases, infections, including hepatitis C, DAAs, and others. And the fact that, when we think about it, that the possibility of raising the profile of HIV research and HIV work would be helpful for us in terms of trying to get additional investments into HIV. I think the second thing that you mentioned as well is, the whole issue of advocacy and how important advocacy is. I mean, when we think of the policy challenges that we are seeing both globally as well as domestically, as well as many of the successes that we've had in HIV domestically and globally, none of that would have been possible without advocacy. And how, when we think about advocacy particularly, why does funding advocacy matter today, generally? And I'd leave that for the whole panel.
I think my motif is, both and, not either or, and obviously advocacy is intimately tied to programming. But I think advocacy is important for shedding light on the new situation, such as the onslaught on the LGBT community in East Africa and legal and cultural borders, but also long-standing patterns. We need to advocacy for cementing, reconstituting generational change in the response is important. Now, to give you an example, I've become quite friendly over the years with Maureen Marenga, who's living with AIDS and is an AIDS activist in Kenya. And we've worked on capacity building for advocacy. But generational change is essential. The people she and others are trying to mentor to integrate into the kind of multi-stakeholder response that PEPFAR or the Global Fund fund. But I really do think also advocacy in donor countries is necessary for the same reason. The getting people to understand the long-standing situation, but also the breaking, changing situation. I'll just give you an example. President Biden boldly hosted the Global Fund Replenishment Conference. He pledged a 28% increase in the U.S. contribution. Congress followed through on that in FY23, but Friends was working with our partners, Friends Japan, Friends Europe, intensively on advocacy, and Germany, the European Commission, Japan, all increased as much or more as the United States. A combination of the leadership from the administration and diplomatically pressing other countries, but civil society advocacy.
In areas that criminalize key populations. Is there anything else that you want to add on why advocacy matters, funding advocacy matters?
Absolutely. Ironically, the pushback that we are experiencing it can also be seen as the work that communities have done around advocacy around just, queer people being African people being very visible. We've seen, like just the public life of especially young people and queer people in the region focus on TikTok, and people are just living there, living as who they are, and that has been there has been a lot of advocacy, to have governments include these populations within national plans for public health planning. There has been a lot of advocacy that even has led to the wins that we find in courts around just engaging judges, engaging legal practitioners in understanding what the issues are, engaging mainstream civil society around the human rights of LGBTQ people, and centering it. It's an issue. The issue is violence. The issue is not identity. It's it's an issue around what are the human rights of people as citizens, as full citizens of our country. So definitely, then. Supporting work around advocacy has been really critical in the moment that we are at. The bill that was passed overwhelmingly in Uganda, it had a small percentage of MPs who voted against it. These are relationships that are being cultivated over the years by activists in Uganda, and these are MPs who even at the moment are already working in their regions to see how is it that they can continue supporting the communities, in terms of as people are getting arrested, how are they working with magistrates to make sure that how the cases are being had is from an informed place. A lot of advocacy with state actors, the police, the magistrates, the local, local governments in all the countries. So there is a huge huge place for advocacy, both in the short term and in the long term. And also then comes to the place of philanthropic advocacy around what type of resourcing are we hearing that is able to, is needed to be able to create that environment where, long-term change can happen. These activists are very loud and clear about what they need. They need flexibility, they need longevity, they need to be able to get the lights on, to keep getting a salary, and just that type of funding that helps, that supports the kind of long-term change, resourcing that is around having communities win. So there's also a place for that philanthropic advocacy.
Thank you so much. I think, one of the things that's important as well is, having some sort of vehicle or some sort of messaging that's going to be helpful for advocates. And, Kaiser Family Foundation is just a master of pulling together incredible policy analyses for both domestic as well as global HIV. And I think personally that it's critically important that that type of work continue to be supported, not only at Kaiser, but elsewhere. And, Lindsay, could you just give us, examples of some of the work that you and your colleagues have been able to do to really help cast how some of these policies might impact communities that are at risk for or living with HIV, and the type of work, the ways that has been able to move policymakers and others into considering these issues?
Thank you. So I think it's first important to make clear, if anybody is not as familiar with our work, that we're a non-advocacy organization, we're nonpartisan. We see ourselves as providing information and filling gaps in information. Our main audiences tend to be policymakers, media, advocacy groups. And I think when information comes out of us and it's really recognized that we truly are nonpartisan, non-advocacy, that advocates can take that information and use it to support their work without feeling as though it comes from a politically partisan organization or think tank. And especially when you're advocating for an issue, say, LGBTQ, health equity, and access, that does have a partisan divide, that the information holds a special weight. And so I think that's one role. We certainly, I see our work doing two things in terms of how we're assessing what policy issues need to be addressed. One is kind of long-term thinking. What kind of data need to be out there so that we have long-term trends and understandings of key issues. Certainly on the global side, our bread and butter in HIV, but global health more broadly, is really tracking funding and budgets and really making that broadly available. On the domestic side, we're working to build that out as well. And then the second piece is, because we're not academics and we don't have to deal with publishing in academic journals, that we can be quite nimble. And that if there's a rising policy issue, that we can get out in front of it quite quickly and get information out. When the Braidwood policy, when the Braidwood decision came out of Texas, within 12, 24 hours, we had media briefings and an analysis out. And so I see those two pieces as really important to our work as well.
It's not possible to do this, monumental work on global HIV alone. Do you have any other additional recommendations for funders in this room or who are listening in about ways that they can partner with the work that you and your colleagues are doing in global HIV?
Sorry about that. We're doing a swap, and I'm a little clumsy. Thank you, as a human. So in terms of how to partner with PEPFAR, so of course the strategy that I mentioned that was released in December really outlines our strategic priorities. So that is one way to get a look at what we're focused on. And second is to reach out. So I am always looking for new partnerships. I think they're critical to think through how we expand and amplify the impact of our programming. I often think of partnerships as both resources and capabilities. So on the capabilities side, as an example, really focused right now on thinking through how we can usher in strategic marketing expertise from the J&J Public Health, from the Meta, folks who have that really specialized expertise that we can embed in our implementing partners to amplify their behavior change. So that's kind of an example of a capability that we look for. And then of course the flip side, which I've already spoken to, is kind of the resource capabilities. So how can we draw in more private capital or DFIs to add and make the pie bigger of total resources that go to HIV/AIDS, and that's both philanthropic partners, but also local banks or the African Development Bank I mentioned as well. But hopefully, contact information is out there. But we view both our longstanding existing partners as critical and actively are looking to develop new ones. Especially as we think through, again, that innovation piece. So how can we get evidence-based innovations that can fill gaps, that can make us work more efficiently and more effectively, and then use the PEPFAR architecture to really scale those up and integrate them. And that's something we really count on our partners for because of the various rules around how we spend our money. So really looking to cultivate more partnerships like that.
HIV epidemic is not over, not by a long shot, either domestically or globally. And what this panel shows, and what we see even from many of the people in this room, is that there's still an epidemic that's taking place, both domestically and globally. And unfortunately, we have new challenges that we have to try and figure out ways that we could address. The wonderful thing, though, is that we also have new blood to help address some of these challenges, both in new advocates and others who are coming into place, new investigators who are interested in policy analyses or research, or potentially new funders who might be interested in funding some specific activities. And I wasn't sure if any of the panelists wanted to just briefly discuss some of the things that they're buoyed by, that they're find optimistic in the HIV response. Just one quick thing, really quick.
I think it is what you kind of stated, that like we have the potential to do really well with our effort to address HIV. And the fact that there are more people living with HIV today is a success story as much as it is a challenge. And that we have the science and we have the tools, but do we have the willpower? Do we have the funding? And are we willing to address the underlying systemic systems of oppression that threaten to undermine our success?
It's all about humans, and you just see the advocates are there, that the youth, the next generation are there. I think of the story again of my colleague from Kenya, Maureen Moringa, living with AIDS. Her elder son got AIDS by her transmission. Her younger child did not. They've survived, her and her son. She started an NGO. She served in the governance of the Global Fund, and now she's mentoring the next generation of advocate implementers. And her mentee is coming to the U.S. to do advocacy in June. That gives me hope that on a micro level, you can have a survivor become an advocate and an activist with impact, and that generational change is happening.
Well, Mark said we can walk and chew gum at the same time. That's one. And Masson said it's easier to end the HIV epidemic than to get to Mars. And President Biden likes to say, we can do hard things. When people ask me, is it possible to end the HIV epidemic, I often lift up some of the work that PEPFAR has done in places like Rwanda and Botswana, which is are at the third 95, and swear that we can do it here in the United States as well, but we have to be committed to reaching that goal.
Yes, I think for me, what hope looks like is just that, what Biden says, we can do hard things, and just the thriving communities that I come from, in spite of everything, in spite of the challenges, and there's still a huge commitment to accessing joy, to accessing wellness, to moving, and creating communities where collective care happens, in terms of even just holding people, in care, in the HIV response. So that gives me a lot of hope, just seeing that joy where there's sometimes no reason to be joyful.
And for me, representing more of the global perspective, we're at the most difficult phase of ending the pandemic. And what excites me about that is that means we need creativity, and we need entrepreneurialism, and we need new partners and new ways of thinking. And I am incredibly grateful to work under Ambassador Nkengasong, truly, who has given at least me and others the latitude to think through different ways and to bring in ideas that may seem very outside of the box, but be open-minded and try new things, as there's recognition that to reach that last 95, 95, 99, 99, 99, we can't keep doing things the way we have been programmatically, even though they've been successful. And so that creativity and entrepreneurialism is what excites me and what brought me to PEPFAR.
Please join me in thanking the panel for a wonderful discussion this morning. Thank you.